Now, I wonder how many people here have ever felt invisible, like you don't matter. Or maybe that you're just unpopular. Maybe you felt so ordinary that you feel like there's no special purpose for you. Or maybe you feel different and like you just don't really fit in anywhere. Interestingly, the vast majority of people feel that they don't fit in, at least at some point in their life. This is a common human experience. But the feeling, despite how common it is, can be incredibly alienating. When I was a teenager, I used to love listening to a certain pop song at the time, and the lyrics went like this: "No one can hear, but you're screaming so loud. You feel like you're all alone in a faceless crowd. Isn't it strange how we all get a little bit weird sometimes? Reaching for a hand that can understand, someone who feels the same. When you live in a cookie-cutter world, being different is a sin, so you don't stand out and you don't fit in. Weird. You don't stand out and you don't fit in." And I wonder how many of us have been able to identify with that feeling at some point. But there are other reasons too why we sometimes feel unseen or invisible. Maybe we're so busy or so burdened with the care of others that we feel unnoticed or unappreciated. Today, I want to share the story of a young woman in the Bible who felt invisible. You see, this woman lived with two of God's chosen people. The man of the house was a prophet of God. In fact, this man had quite regular encounters with God that were absolutely profound. Later in the Bible, this same man is described as the friend of God. The man was wealthy, very wealthy. He was clearly blessed. The man's wife was beautiful, the envy of many. And in fact, the wife's beauty was in all likelihood the very reason why the young woman in our story came to know this couple. We are talking, of course, about Hagar, the maidservant of Sarah and the concubine of Abraham. If you'll turn over with me to Genesis 16, and we'll see in the opening verse that Hagar is identified as an Egyptian woman. Now, it's likely that Hagar was a gift to Sarah after Abraham and Sarah sojourned in Egypt in Genesis 12. Now, you might remember that incident. Pharaoh was taken by the beauty of Sarah, and he took her into his house, not realizing that she was actually the wife of Abraham. Abraham, in that instance, had allowed fear to creep in and worried that someone might kill him to take Sarah for themselves. He spun a half-truth that, it probably seemed pretty clever at the time. Abraham and Sarah declared themselves to be brother and sister, which was not entirely untrue, but it certainly wasn't the full picture. But of course, when we act on fear, we end up hurting ourselves, all those around us as well. Abraham's half-truth was the beginning of some bitter experiences for everybody involved. Pharaoh, upon learning the truth about Sarah's relationship to Abraham, returned her and sent the couple on their way. But it's likely that Hagar joined them at this point. Hagar was likely a gift of appeasement to Sarah mentioned in Genesis 12:16. And I think, Hagar must have felt so unimportant. As a maidservant, she had no control over her own life, no control over her choices, no freedoms. I wonder what it was like to be Hagar. And if her own social standing made her feel inadequate, I wonder how she interpreted the fact that Abraham and Sarah were God's chosen and elect. They were divinely blessed. And what about her? Was she cursed? Did God despise her because of her lowly status or because of her origins? But then again, women were generally considered of little importance to begin with in those times. Now, in Genesis 16, Sarah is still known as Sarai and Abraham still known as Abraham. And I hope you don't mind, but I'll generally refer to them as Abraham and Sarah. They're sort of better known names, but as we read the text, they'll be referred to as Abram and Sarai. So let's read. I'm reading from verse 2. So Sarai said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. As Hagar's mistress, Sarah had authority over her. And when Sarah, longing to have a child, was distraught by her own barrenness, she decided to help God fulfill his promises. You see, her faith had wavered. She didn't think God was really going to do this on his own. Surely God wanted her to do her part. And by the way, surrogacy wasn't unheard of in those times and in that culture. The ancient code of Hammurabi, which was written in the same sort of time period and same sort of place, mentions various rules and regulations around surrogacy in the ancient Near East. Because Sarah was the mistress, she could give Hagar to Abraham as a concubine, and legally, the children born of such a relationship were Sarah's. You see, Hagar had no control over her own body, no control over her marriage partner, no control over any other aspect of her life. But whatever Hagar thought of the arrangement, it wasn't long before she fell pregnant to Abraham. We read in verse 4, "So he went in to Hagar and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes." And look, maybe that was the pregnancy hormones. I can tell you firsthand that pregnancy hormones can do some funny things to you. They can give you some emotional roller coasters. But whatever the case, things are getting tense between Sarah and Hagar at this point. We're told here in verse 4 that Sarah is despised in Hagar's eyes. Now, the word despise, it literally means to treat lightly. Maybe Hagar felt or hoped that she was in fact the woman to bear the child of promise that God had spoken of. Maybe Hagar resented Sarah being the mistress of her life. Maybe Hagar felt she should have equal position and authority with Sarah now that she was bearing Abraham's child. But whatever the case, Sarah is pretty unhappy. She confronts Abraham over it in verse 5. And Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." The Lord judge between you and me. Sarah is blaming Abraham. She's suggesting that God is on her side against Abraham for allowing the situation to develop as it has developed. Now, Abraham doesn't want to get into this dispute. He doesn't want to get between these two women. So he says in verse 6, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. We're told that Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar. And it's hard to know exactly what this phrase means. The word harshly, it literally means to afflict, to humble, to hurt. It could have been a verbal dressing down. It could have been physical punishment. But whatever the case, we can be sure that whatever happened, it must have been very harsh indeed. Because Hagar, she runs. And we discover in the next verse that she runs into the wilderness. Picture, if you can, this young woman pregnant, all alone in the wilderness of Canaan. Women didn't generally travel alone in those times. It was incredibly dangerous, much less a pregnant woman. Man, I can tell you, I wouldn't want to flee into the wilderness right now in today's society, but I can tell you it was a lot more dangerous then. Whatever was said or done, Hagar must have felt desperate. She must have felt deeply hurt. She must have felt maybe even rejected by God himself. It appears that she had no one to run to. It's possible that she was running back to Egypt and she was heading south through the wilderness on her way, but in all likelihood, she was running into the wilderness because there was no one to run to. Who would help a runaway pregnant slave anyway? Did anyone care? Did anyone have any idea of what she was going through? Did anyone have any idea of what she had been through? It must have felt like nobody cared. Let's read verses 7 and 8. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? You see, something very unusual happens to Hagar in the wilderness. The angel of the Lord, which, by the way, is a name often given to God himself when he appears to or interacts with humanity. But the angel of the Lord speaks with this desperate, fleeing, outcast woman who no one cares about. God has sought her out and found her. You know, Hagar didn't make the first move here. She didn't go seeking God or calling on God. He came seeking her. God is seeking every one of us in the same way. You know, as Revelation 3:20 tells us, that Jesus is standing on the door and knocking. If we will let him in, he has already sought us out. He's already found us. He's there knocking. Now, in the passage here, God addresses Hagar by name. And he references her situation as Sarah's maid. He makes it clear immediately that he knows her. And she must have been thinking, who knows who I am? Who knows me? Who would pay attention to her? But although God already knows her situation, and he often does this when he's interacting with humanity, he gives her a chance to be heard. God already knows her story, but he wants to give her the chance to be heard. Where have you come from? And where are you going? A chance for her to stop and consider both her past and her future. First, he addresses her by name, and then he asks her. And as you read through the Bible, we often find that when we take a wrong turn in life, the first thing God does is he speaks to our identity. He calls us by name, by who we are. And then, afterwards, he will ask us to examine our motives, examine our hearts. Now, Hagar here honestly admits that she's fleeing from the presence of her mistress. I think she feels that there is nothing that she can hide from the one who's speaking to her. In verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." Oof. God tells Hagar to return to Sarah and submit to her. And I imagine they would be really hard words to swallow. God wanted her to return to the person who had caused her so much pain. I mean, there at least, perhaps she would be able to deliver her child safely into the world. And it's an intriguing thought in this passage too, that Hagar, she was an Egyptian slave in Abraham's house, but that in just a few generations, Abraham's descendants would be slaves in Egypt. And I wonder what God was trying to teach them there. Sometimes in life too, God doesn't take away our difficulties in the way that we want him to. And I think we can all be tempted at times, and I think I've spoken about this before, but we can all be tempted at times to fall for that prosperity gospel that we see illustrated in Christian movies or that we, read in those popular Christian devotionals. But you only need to take a look at the actual heroes of faith in the Bible to discover that being a follower of God, it doesn't resolve everything. It doesn't resolve every difficult relationship. It doesn't give you instant health and wealth. And in fact, if we're really real about it, often life gets harder. It gets more challenging. Jesus didn't say, take up your cross for nothing. Take up your cross. I think that phrase is sometimes almost lost on us. Christians will wear often a little cross around our neck. And without really maybe appreciating how confronting that phrase was, take up your cross in the time, it would be almost like today if we were wearing a little sterling silver electric chair, a little sterling silver noose around our neck. It was a symbol of torturous death. Take up your cross. And it was that confronting when Jesus said those words. So God doesn't promise to take away our trials in this life, but he does promise to walk with us through those trials. He does promise us the strength necessary to face our battles. And he does promise that one day he will make everything right. But let's read on in Genesis 16 because a really remarkable thing happens. God gives Hagar a promise. So picking up in verse 10, then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Now, the opening words of this promise, they are almost identical words to the promise that God made to Abraham. God makes this promise to Hagar. He says he will multiply her descendants so that they can't be counted. Now, this kind of promise is not made anywhere else in the Bible other than to Abraham himself. God's personal address and promise to Hagar, it lifts her up as an equal in the sight of God. She and Abraham are equals in the sight of God. Hagar is one of only a handful of women in the biblical narrative that God addresses personally like this. And it's also the first time that God names a child before their birth. Ishmael means God will hear, or God listens, because God heard Hagar's pain. He heard her affliction. And in response, quite incredibly, quite shockingly, Hagar gives God a name. We read it in verse 13. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? This is a really unusual thing to do. In fact, Hagar is the only person in the Bible to give God a name in response to a personal experience with him. She names him in the Hebrew El Roi, the God who sees me, the God who sees me. When no one else sees you, God sees you. And I know that there are people here today who feel invisible, who feel unnoticed, unappreciated. And to the man who's sitting here today, whose best efforts go unnoticed at home, who feels that no matter what he does, it will never be good enough, God sees you. He sees you today. He knows you and he knows your pain. He sees you. To the young woman sitting here today who feels that she is never good enough and will never amount to anything worthwhile, God sees you. He has a purpose for you. You are precious to him. If no one else sees you, God sees you. To the woman who is home caring for children, for family, trying to juggle all her responsibilities and feeling invisible and so worn out, God sees you today. Those things that you do each day that just seem so unimportant, so unappreciated, so futile, they're seen by God. They are noticed by him. You are seen by God. He knows you. He knows your efforts, and he sees you. To the older man or the older woman who's struggling with their worth and value in this world, you are worth everything to the Almighty. Your prayers have not gone unheard. God sees you. Like Gideon, sometimes our family background or our social status or our own poor self-esteem leaves us feeling that there is no way God would want us. God would never call us to any special work for him. Gideon was visited by an angel, but his own self-doubt led him to check and double-check. After all, why would God choose him? But this is where we are mistaken. You are so deeply wanted, so deeply loved by God. You are so valuable to him. He knows every pain of your heart, every secret that you're too ashamed to even share with your spouse, every doubt, every questioning, every failing, and he loves you. He knows it all, and he still wants you. He has a special plan for you. God has already scripted you a part to play in his work, if you're willing. God sees you. And I would like to invite each of you today to open your heart to the God who sees you. And when you pray, pour out your heart to him. God sought this kind of interaction with Hagar. He already knew where she was coming from. He already knew where she was going. But he asked, where have you come from and where are you going? He wanted to hear the pain of her past. He wanted to hear the longing for her future, even though he already knew. Pour out your heart to God. He is eager to hear you. He's eager to connect with you. You matter. You matter to him.